Human stayed with an alien girl through the silent night. Her dawn gesture meant far more. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The wind pushed against the old observation outpost like a tired animal, its metal siding groaning with every gust. Ethan Cole steadied the loose panel with one hand while his flashlight flickered across the narrow hallway. Frost crept over the floor like spilled powder. The night out here wasn't just cold. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ribs, heavy and slow. Ethan's boots crunched softly as he stepped inside, each breath turning into a soft cloud drifting away in front of him. His jacket was still damp from the walk-in. He'd lost the trail markers 2 hours earlier when the storm rolled over the ridge. All he wanted was a roof over his head until sunrise, something to break the wind. That's when he heard it, a faint vibration, almost too small to notice, like someone holding their breath a little too long. He lowered the flashlight. The beam landed on a dim corner of the room, catching a shimmer, blue, soft, almost like moonlit glass. Ethan didn't move right away. The small figure pressed against the wall didn't move either. She was curled tight, arms wrapped around herself, her skin the pale blue of polished stone. Her eyes, wide and bright, followed him with quiet fear. He raised his hand slightly, showing he wasn't holding anything but a dented flashlight. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she understood. The storm outside slammed into the outpost again, rattling the frame hard enough to make dust fall from the ceiling. Instinct pushed him forward, not to approach her, but to push the broken panel back into place. The cold eased a little. He pulled off his pack, unzipped it slowly, and took out the one thing he had worth sharing. His spare thermal blanket, still folded. Ethan set it on the floor halfway between them and slid it gently toward her before backing away again. No words, no explanations, just an offering. The girl didn't touch it at first. Her breath trembled in the cold, drifting like faint smoke. Ethan sat down near the opposite wall, leaning against it, keeping his movements slow and easy. He could feel the chill of the metal through his jacket, but he didn't complain. A few minutes later, he saw her fingers inch forward, brushing the edge of the blanket with hesitant curiosity. She pulled it toward her, wrapped it around her small frame, and let out the faintest sigh. Ethan exhaled too, shoulders loosening. The night settled again, deep and silent. No conversation, just shared cold, shared breath, and the fragile kind of trust born when two strangers have no one else to rely on. Outside, the wind howled through the empty landscape. Inside, the outpost held them both, one human, one alien, waiting for the first light of dawn. The heater in Ethan's jacket clicked softly as it tried to keep up with the icy air drifting through the gaps in the outpost walls. He rubbed his hands together, letting the quiet settle again. The storm outside had eased, but the cold still clung to the metal like it did not want to let go. Across the room, the alien girl sat wrapped in the thin blanket he had given her, her knees pulled close, her eyes reflecting the small lantern light like ember-colored glass. Ethan kept his gaze on the floor for a while, giving her space. She had not spoken since that single question earlier, and he did not plan on pushing her. Trust never grew faster just because someone wanted it to. He checked his wrist device, tapping the cracked screen until it lit with faint orange numbers. The battery was dropping fast. He would need to conserve it. He shut it off and rested his hands on his knees. The girl shifted slightly, the blanket rustling. He glanced up and found her watching him, her expression cautious but less tense than before. A few strands of her pale blue hair had slipped loose, catching the light with a soft glow. Ethan offered a tired half-smile. "The storm should pass before morning," he said quietly, not expecting a response. She tilted her head, studying the shape of his words rather than their meaning. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed at the lantern. Her voice came out soft, almost musical despite the strain. "Warm." Ethan nodded. "Warm." He nudged it a little closer to her, without crossing the invisible line she kept around herself. She watched his hand move, her eyes following every inch as if learning his intentions from the small details. She repeated the word, warm, more certain this time. He nodded again. Yeah, warmer than out there, at least. Her gaze drifted toward the trembling door panel he had braced earlier. The wind hummed through the metal, a steady low sound that made both of them look up. She pulled the blanket tighter and whispered something he did not understand. Ethan leaned back against the cold wall and breathed in the dusty air. He cleared his throat gently. My name is Ethan, he said, tapping his chest once. Ethan. The girl watched his gesture, hesitated, then mimicked it. Her hand touched her chest lightly. Selah, she said. The name settled between them like a small spark. Ethan nodded, repeating it softly. Selah. She blinked, and something in her posture eased. The silence returned, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a space where neither of them needed to pretend they were not exhausted. Ethan adjusted his position, pulling his jacket closer around himself. He was aware of the cold biting at his toes, aware of his breath fogging thinly in front of him. Selah, still wrapped tight, looked at him with a faint crease of concern, the kind that appeared before someone decided whether or not to reach toward another living being. She lifted the blanket a little, almost an invitation, then lowered it again, unsure. Ethan shook his head softly, smiling. You keep it. You need it more. She did not understand all the words, but she understood enough. Her eyes softened. Outside, the storm tapped faintly on the walls, as if checking whether the two inside had given up yet. They had not. And for the first time since Ethan had stepped into the outpost, the night no longer felt entirely empty. The lantern's glow thinned as its power cell drained, the lights softening into a warm amber that barely touched the edges of the room. Ethan slid his hands into his sleeves, rubbing some heat back into his fingers. Hours had passed, though. It was hard to tell how many. Nighttime on this planet stretched longer than any day he was used to. Selah shifted again, curling the blanket closer around her shoulders. The soft fabric rose and fell with each careful breath she took. Her eyes, no longer wide with fear, followed the slow drift of dust motes in the warm pocket of light between them. Ethan watched her for a moment, not staring, just trying to read the subtle signals she gave off. Every movement was small, deliberate, like she was trying not to disturb the fragile space that had formed between them. When she lifted her head, he noticed how tired she looked. There were faint lines near her temples, marks he had not seen earlier. They caught the light only when she moved, shimmering like faint silver patterns beneath her skin. She caught him looking and lowered her gaze, almost shy. Ethan cleared his throat gently. You injured? He asked, motioning lightly toward the marks. She blinked once, then shook her head, pressing a hand flat over her heart again. Cold, she murmured, using the word he had said earlier. Not hurt, just cold. Ethan nodded, understanding. Yeah, he whispered. Cold gets everywhere out here. She tilted her head, searching for the meaning. He tapped the floor lightly with his knuckles. Cold in the walls. Cold in the air. Cold in the bones. Selah listened, then nodded with a soft hum, as if the words made sense in a way she could feel rather than translate. A soft gust rattled the metal frame again. Ethan winced at the draft sneaking in through the gaps. He stood slowly, not wanting to startle her, and crossed to the edge of the room where a loose pipe hung near the ceiling. He pushed his shoulder against it, forcing it back into place just enough to reduce the airflow. The motion scraped dust off his jacket, sending it drifting in small pale clouds. When he stepped back, Selah was watching him with a look he could not quite read. It was not fear, and it was not confusion. It was something gentler, something cautious, but warmer than before. Ethan eased back to the floor, settling at a comfortable distance. Better, he said softly. She echoed the word. Better. Then, slowly, she extended one small hand from beneath the blanket and pointed at his jacket. She mimed pulling something close around herself, then looked at him expectantly. Ethan blinked before understanding dawned. She was asking if he was warm enough. He let out a quiet laugh, surprised. I am fine, he reassured, patting his chest as she had earlier. Ethan warm. She repeated the gesture, tapping her own chest. Selah warm. Something eased between them, a kind of quiet acknowledgement that neither of them needed to be alone with the cold anymore. For the first time, her shoulders relaxed fully, the tension melting away in tiny increments. She looked around the dim outpost, then gestured at the lantern, then at the wall, then at him. It took Ethan a second to understand she was asking if they were safe here. He nodded with assurance. Safe enough for tonight. Selah held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes steady and bright in the low light. She pulled the blanket a little higher under her chin and whispered something soft in her own language, almost like a thank you carried on a breath. The storm outside had faded into a distant hum. Inside, the silence grew warm again, settling around them like a fragile but growing promise that dawn would come. The night stretched on, softer now, no longer sharp at the edges. The lantern's glow trembled each time the wind brushed the walls, but it held steady enough to keep the shadows from swallowing the room entirely. Ethan shifted his weight, stretching his legs carefully to keep them from falling asleep. His boots were cold, stiff from the hours of sitting still. Selah watched him with quiet attention, as if learning something from every small motion he made. Her eyes tracked the way he rubbed warmth back into his knees, the way his shoulders rose and fell with a tired breath. She looked down at her own hands, turning them palm up beneath the blanket. Her skin caught the dim light, glowing faintly like the surface of a frozen lake. After a moment, she reached into the folds of the blanket and brought out a small object he had not seen earlier. It was a circular stone, smooth and pale blue, no larger than a coin. She held it delicately between her fingers, then extended it halfway toward him. Ethan blinked. Is that yours? She nodded once, then pushed it forward another inch. He hesitated, then accepted the silent offer, taking the stone between his fingers. It was unexpectedly warm, like it held heat despite the cold air. A faint pulse traveled through it, a gentle rhythm almost like a slow heartbeat. Selah watched his reaction closely. Selah, she said, tapping her chest, then pointed at the stone. Ethan nodded, understanding slowly forming. Yours, he said softly. She mimicked the word. Yours. Then she shook her head and pointed to him. For Ethan. He looked at the stone again, turning it in his hand. The warmth from it traveled up into his palm, easing the sting of the cold. Thank you, he murmured, genuinely touched. She pulled the blanket tighter and gave a small nod, as if relieved he accepted it. A faint hum traveled through the outpost walls, trailing off into silence. Ethan glanced toward the door. Storm is almost done, he said. Selah followed his gaze, then looked back at him with a question forming in her expression. She lifted her hand and pointed at the ceiling, then at the door, then at him. You leave? She asked, shaping the words carefully. Ethan took a slow breath. At sunrise, I have to try to reach the main trail, he said, pointing toward the mountains beyond the wall. I need to find the survey team. She listened, her eyes dimming slightly. Ethan leave? She repeated, softer. He met her gaze, then shook his head gently. Not now? Not until the storm ends. Selah's shoulders released a tension she had been holding. She sat still for a long moment, then reached out one hand, stopping halfway between them before pulling it back to her chest. She whispered his name, almost like a question. Ethan. He looked up at her, waiting. She placed her hand over her heartbeat again. Safe, she said, tapping lightly. With Ethan, safe. The words were halting, imperfect, but they carried a weight he could feel. Ethan swallowed, nodding slowly. You are safe, he said quietly. I promise. Selah's eyes softened, glowing gently in the dim lantern light. The storm outside faded into a distant whisper, and for the first time, the outpost felt less like a shelter for strangers and more like a fragile bridge between two worlds that had never meant to meet, but somehow found each other in the cold. The lantern dimmed to a soft glow, its light thinning until it felt more like a memory than a flame. Ethan adjusted its angle, trying to squeeze out just a little more brightness, but the power cell had given almost everything it had. A gentle hush settled over the outpost, the kind that made every small sound feel louder. Ethan could hear Selah's slow breathing beneath the blanket, steady, and even now that the cold no longer clawed at her so fiercely. She sat with her back against the wall, her eyes half-lidded but awake, following the rhythmic sway of the fading light. Something about the stillness made the room feel warmer than it actually was. She lifted her small blue stone again, letting it rest in her hands like it belonged there. Its faint inner glow was more noticeable now, a shy warmth pulsing beneath her palms. Ethan leaned forward slightly, watching her fingertips trace the smooth edge. She looked up at him, then offered the stone again, not for him to take this time, but for him to see more clearly. He leaned closer, letting the faint warmth brush his skin. It reminded him of sunlight held in a tiny cage. It reacts to you, he whispered. Sayla tilted her head, her eyes reflecting the low light. React? She repeated, slow and careful. He nodded, cupping his hands near the stone without touching it. It warms when you hold it. Your hands make it brighter. She considered this, then turned her palms upward, letting the stone sit in the center. The glow deepened, soft and steady, casting a gentle light across her face. Ethan watched her expression shift from fatigue to something almost peaceful. She extended her hand again, bringing the stone close to him. The warmth drifted toward him, a small wave of comfort in the cold room. The gesture was simple, wordless, but it felt like an invitation to share something she did not know how to put into speech. Ethan let his hand hover near it, letting the warmth brush his fingers. She smiled faintly, a quick, flickering thing that softened the lines of her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence became a companion, not a threat. She studied him again, her eyes drifting from his hands to his jacket, then to his tired face. Something in her expression changed, settling into gentle concern. She lifted the edge of her blanket and, after a hesitant pause, extended it enough that it could cover part of the space between them. Her other hand tapped the floor lightly. An offering. A place beside her. Ethan exhaled slowly, surprised by the gesture. You sure? He asked, his voice soft. She nodded, her eyes steady. Warm, she said simply. He shifted closer, careful not to crowd her. The blanket brushed his arm, carrying a faint warmth from her body and the glowing stone she held. The moment held quiet significance, not romantic, not dramatic, just real and human and deeply gentle. Sayla adjusted the blanket's edge, making sure it covered him too, even if only slightly. She whispered something in her own language, a soft thread of sound that drifted into the air like a lullaby. He did not understand the words, but the tone carried gratitude, trust, and something fragile that she was trying to share. Ethan rested his head lightly against the wall. We wait for dawn, he said quietly. Sayla nodded, her eyes closing halfway as she leaned into the faint warmth between them. The night outside remained vast and cold, but inside the outpost, two strangers sat beneath a shared blanket and a fading lantern, holding on to the small light they had left. The lantern finally gave out, leaving only the soft glow from Sayla's stone to paint faint shapes across the outpost walls. The darkness did not feel empty now. It felt calm, almost suspended, as if the night itself was catching its breath. Ethan shifted under the shared blanket, careful not to disturb Sayla. The warmth between them was thin but steady, enough to take the edge off the cold air that seeped into every seam of the room. Sayla held the glowing stone near her chest, her fingers curled around it with a kind of reverence. Its light pulsed softly, casting gentle reflections across her face. Ethan watched her for a moment, studying the small patterns of luminescence across her skin. The faint lines at her temples glowed a little brighter in the darkness, forming delicate shapes he had not noticed before. She caught him looking again and turned her face slightly away, perhaps shy or simply unsure of how much she should reveal. Ethan lowered his head. Sorry, he said quietly. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I just have never met anyone like you. She looked back at him, her eyes steady. Ethan, look, she said, tapping her own chest lightly. Sayla not hurt. Her voice held no offense, only simple fact. She lifted one hand, traced the glowing lines near her temple with her fingertips, then motioned toward him. Markings. For cold. Ethan frowned a little. They glow when you get cold. She nodded. Glow means body protect. He exhaled softly, impressed. That is incredible. She repeated the word carefully. Incredible. A soft stillness filled the moment, the kind that formed when two people finally understood something about each other without needing a long explanation. The wind pressed against the walls again, but quieter now. Sayla looked toward the sound, her expression tightening with a hint of fear. Ethan followed her gaze. It is all right, he said. Storm is almost done. She turned back to him, her eyes uncertain. Storm end. Ethan, go. The words landed heavier this time. Ethan hesitated. He had to reach the survey team, but leaving her alone did not sit well with him. He rubbed his hands together, thinking. I need to find help, he said slowly, choosing each word. But I will not leave you in danger. She blinked, trying to process the idea. Not leave, she repeated. A quiet question. Ethan nodded. Not leave you behind. Not while you are cold, or hurt, or alone out here. Her breath hitched softly, almost inaudible. She pressed her hand flat over her heart, the stone glowing brighter with the movement. Ethan, she whispered, searching for the next words. Then she shook her head, frustrated that she did not have them. Ethan leaned slightly closer, careful, patient. Take your time, he murmured. Selah looked up at him again, her eyes reflecting the warm light between them. After a long pause, she touched her hand to her heart once more. Selah, trust. The words were soft, fragile, almost trembling. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not painful, just real. Thank you, he whispered. No more words formed after that. They did not need them. Selah leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half closed, letting the warmth from the stone spread between them. Ethan stayed awake a little longer, listening to her breathing grow steady and calm. Outside, the storm faded to a distant sigh, and inside the outpost, trust settled into the quiet. Like a slow, steady dawn waiting beyond the darkness. The first hint of dawn pressed against the outpost walls, turning the metal a faint shade of gray. The storm had quieted completely, leaving behind a cold that settled in every breath. Ethan blinked the sleep from his eyes, realizing he must have drifted off for a moment. Selah was still beside him, her breathing soft and even, the glowing stone cupped between her hands like a small captured sunrise. The glow had dimmed during the night, but it still pushed back the darkness just enough for him to see her features clearly. Her markings were duller now, no longer flaring with the cold, which meant her body temperature was stabilizing. That eased something in him, something he had not even realized he was holding so tightly. He stretched quietly, careful not to disturb her. But as he shifted, Selah's eyes opened slowly. She looked up at him with the bleary softness of someone waking from a deep, much-needed rest. Light, she whispered, noticing the faint dawn seeping through the cracks in the metal. Ethan nodded. Almost morning. She blinked, then sat up straighter, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. For a brief moment, she looked stronger, more herself. But the illusion broke quickly. As she moved, her breath trembled, and her body swayed with a faint weakness he had not seen the night before. Ethan caught her elbow lightly to steady her. Easy, he murmured. She took in a few slow breaths before her eyes drifted toward the door. Something passed over her face, an expression he could not read at first. Then she pointed toward the outside, tapping her chest. Selah, go. Ethan shook his head. Not yet. You are too cold. She frowned and repeated the gesture, more urgently this time. Go. Need go. Ethan hesitated, weighing her insistence against her condition. Dawn would bring clearer paths, but it would also bring dropping temperatures before the sun warmed the ridge. Selah tried to stand, but her knees buckled slightly. Ethan stepped forward, instinctively catching her as she leaned into him for balance. Her body was lighter than he expected, fragile, like she carried more cold inside her than warmth. She looked up at him with frustration, not at him, but at her own weakness. Body wrong, she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently. Not wrong. Just tired. You have been through a lot. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. When she opened them again, a different kind of urgency flickered there, something deeper than fear. She placed the warm stone into his hands and held them there, her fingers curling lightly around his. Help Selah, she whispered. Selah, show way. Ethan swallowed hard. Her trust hit him like a weight he was not sure he deserved. He looked toward the faint line of dawn pressing against the horizon through the cracked metal. If she had somewhere she needed to go, somewhere important enough to push through the cold for, then he would help her get there. She released his hands and tried once more to stand. This time, Ethan moved beside her, offering his support without hesitation. She leaned into him just enough to steady her balance, her breathing still uneven but determined. Together, they walked toward the door. The cold seeped through the cracks, sharper now, but the sky beyond was clearing. You lead, Ethan said softly. I stay with you. Selah looked at him for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the first thin streak of dawn. Then she nodded, and with a trembling breath, she reached for the door. Cold air spilled into the outpost the moment Selah pulled the door open, a steady breath of dawn wind carrying the last traces of the storm across the barren ridge. Ethan steadied her as she stepped outside, her legs still trembling from the long night, but her eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon. The sky was washed in pale blue and soft gold, the early sunlight laying thin strokes of color over the icy ground. Frost clung to every rock and metal scrap, sparkling like tiny crystals. Selah paused just outside the threshold, lifting her face toward the morning light. The markings along her temples glowed faintly, responding to the change in temperature and the new warmth brushing her skin. She exhaled slowly, almost in relief. Ethan watched her take a careful step forward, then another. "Where are you trying to go?" he asked gently. Selah pointed toward a narrow path that wound between two ridges, her expression tightening with urgency. "Home signal," she said. "Selah need find." Ethan followed her gesture with his eyes. The path looked uneven and frosted over, but manageable. "All right," he said, adjusting his pack. Take it slow." Selah nodded and clutched the glowing stone against her chest. The light from it brightened as the cold nipped at them again. She moved with determination, even if her steps were still unsteady. Ethan stayed close, matching her pace, ready to catch her if she faltered. They walked for several minutes in quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots and the distant whisper of wind sliding across the ridge. Selah's breath formed soft clouds in the air, each one fading quickly in the growing light. After some time, Selah stopped and pointed toward a shallow dip in the terrain where frost-covered plants bent under the weight of ice. "Selah came from there," she whispered. Ethan looked closer and saw faint traces in the snow, almost erased by the storm. A collapsed shape lay half-buried under frost, metallic and smooth. It was the remains of a small pod or device. Selah approached it with slow steps. Her hand hovered over the metal, her fingers trembling. "Signal broken," she said softly. Selah lost. Ethan crouched beside her, brushing away some frost to get a better look. The pod was cracked, its surface split from impact. The inside was dark, its components frozen solid. No chance of repair. Selah sank to her knees beside it, her head lowering, the glow of her stone dimming as her hope thinned. Ethan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You survived," he said quietly, "and you made it through the night. That counts for something." She looked at him, eyes filled with tired confusion. "Why help?" Ethan blinked. "What do you mean?" She touched her chest, then his, mimicking the motion she had learned. "Ethan warm. Ethan protect." "What?" Ethan took a slow breath, letting the cold air settle before answering. "Because you needed someone. Because it was the right thing to do. You were alone out here." Selah studied his face, searching for something she did not yet have words for. Then she lifted her stone and held it between them. The light inside brightened, glowing a soft gold instead of blue. Ethan frowned gently. It changed color. Selah nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they did not fall. "Stone shows truth." "Shows," she touched her chest again. "Heartwarm." Ethan felt his own chest tighten at the meaning she struggled to share. She placed the stone carefully into his hands, letting the warmth spill across his skin. "For Ethan," she whispered. But this time, her voice carried something deeper than gratitude. Something like a revelation. Something like the truth she could no longer hide. The golden glow inside the stone deepened as Ethan held it, warming his palms in a way the cold morning air could not touch. Selah watched him with a quiet intensity, her breath forming small white clouds that drifted in the soft dawn breeze. The ridge around them shimmered with frost, every surface catching the rising sun in thin streaks of silver. Selah placed one hand gently over his, closing his fingers around the stone. "Truth," she whispered. "Stone show truth." Ethan searched her face, trying to understand the meaning beneath her trembling words. "What truth?" She pressed her other hand to her chest, over the faint glow that pulsed beneath her skin. "Selah heartwarm, for Ethan." The words came out slow, shaped with effort, but steady. Ethan felt the weight of what she was giving him, not just the stone, but something far more fragile. He swallowed softly. "Selah." She shook her head lightly, her eyes lifting toward the sky where the faint outline of a distant starship glimmered far above the atmosphere, almost invisible in the morning light. "Home come," she said, voice quiet. A soft hum vibrated through the air, distant but growing. Ethan turned to look, recognizing the sound of approaching engines. Sayla's people had found the crash site. They were coming for her. Sayla did not move toward the sound. Instead, she stepped closer to Ethan, bringing her hands up to rest lightly against his chest. Something in her expression shifted, softening into an emotion he could feel even without words. "Ethan, stay in night," she whispered. "Sayla, not forget." The hum grew louder, the ship descending slowly behind the ridge. Ethan understood what this meant. She had a life waiting for her, a place he could not follow. Sayla reached up and pressed her forehead gently to the back of his hand, the same gesture she had offered the glowing stone, a gesture of trust and honor. Her skin was cool but steady, the markings along her temples shimmering like threads of morning light. Ethan let out a slow breath, his voice barely above the wind. "You are safe now." Sayla lifted her gaze, her eyes reflecting the dawn. Safe, because Ethan. The ship settled on the ridge with a soft rush of air, its lights sweeping gently across the frost. Sayla stepped back, hesitating, her fingers trailing along his hand until they slipped away completely. She held his gaze one last time, her expression filled with a depth he could not name. Then she turned toward the waiting ship, walking slowly, each step measured, as if the ground itself asked her to linger. The stone in Ethan's hand pulsed once more, warm as a heartbeat. Sayla paused at the base of the ridge and looked back at him. The sun rose behind her, outlining her silhouette in bright gold, turning her markings into delicate bands of light. She lifted her hand in a silent farewell, her eyes soft and warm across the cold distance. Ethan stood still, the stone glowing in his palm, its warmth settling deep into him like a promise carried through the quiet morning air. No words passed between them. None were needed. The dawn answered for both of them, soft and full of meaning, as Sayla stepped into the waiting light and disappeared from sight.